So in terms of the Class 2 and 3 buildings, so they've actually been permitted since the mid-90s. So the requirements for these low-rise buildings hasn't changed. So, and Paul alluded to some of the work that was done by Professor Vaughan Beck in the 90s, which led to the code change. So since about 94, we've been able to build 3-storey timber-framed apartment buildings. And then in 2014, following a submission from the industry, we also enabled that to be extended to Class 3 buildings. So typically hotel, motel type developments. So these buildings for low-rise are all non-sprinklered. So you don't need any sprinklers for these buildings, and that's still the case today. What I thought I'd do is just, because I know we've got a range of professions in the audience, was just quickly go through some of the requirements. So for a Class 2 and 3 buildings under the low-rise DTS provisions, so you can do a 1-storey with a Type C construction. Basically, it's the least fire-resistive form of construction. Or you can do 3 stories and above for Type A, which is the most fire-resistive construction. And then you have 2 stories is a Type B, which is somewhere in between. So those forms of construction are all stipulated in the NCC. But specifically in relation to timber buildings, so for Type A construction, so the most fire resistive, so for Class 2 and 3 buildings, timber has a concession in the NCC under specification C 1.1 clause 3.10. So basically for a Class 2 or 3 building, as long as the rise in stories isn't more than 3, you can use timber framing throughout. So the whole structure can be timber framed. Any insulation you put into the structure itself, be it for thermal efficiency or acoustic provisions, needs to be non-combustible, and you need an automatic smoke alarm system throughout the building. So they're the key requirements for low-rise timber buildings for 3 stories. But we can actually go to 4 stories if the lowest story is used for some sort of car parking, typically, application. It has to be constructed of concrete or masonry. So in effect, the ground floor would be a car park, concrete or masonry, and put 3 levels of timber above. There has to be a separation between the ground floor and the next story above. So you need to achieve a fire resistance level of 90 at that floor ceiling level. So the ground floor, floor ceiling, 90, 90, 90, 3 stories of timber frame above. For the type, it's same for Type B construction, except it's clause 4.3. Type B is that sort of intermediate form of construction. So you're only permitted to go to 2 stories, and that's why that first table, I put that up there. So you're not sort of saying, well, why is it only 2? That's the way the NCC is drafted. So we can only do 2 stories for Type B construction. Again, timber frame throughout, non-combustible insulation, and automatic smoke alarm. You can have a ground floor in a car park, but you're still only at 2 stories. So we have a car park with Type B construction with a 1 story above in timber framing. So that's just a bit of the difference between the Type A and Type B construction. Type C is 1 level only. Paul touched on this, and I thought I'd expand a little bit. There's been a lot of discussion about using external cladding. We saw the building fire in Melbourne with the high-rise building at Lacrosse, the Lacrosse building, high-rise facade combustible that went up. In relation to low-rise buildings under the concession for timber, basically it says you need not comply with the requirements of clause C 1.9A. And basically that is for any of the non-combustible material requirements. So C119A covers that. So we can still have our timber framing provided we've got that non-combustible insulation and smoke alarm system. But what clause C 1.9A says, that with that concession for timber, you need not comply with the requirements for the walls, external walls, including all components incorporated in them, including the facade covering. So timber cladding on low-rise buildings has been around since the mid-90s and is still permitted under the NCC. question.
How does polystyrene cladding?
It doesn't fit in there under that provision. So that's a concession for timber. The work that Paul alluded to that was done by Beck and Jung looked at timber cladding on the outside of buildings where they compared with existing non-combustible construction. So in terms of other forms of cladding, I have no comment to make on their use, except that the concession enables us to use timber on the outside. So just in terms of the low-rise buildings, so we can do 3-storey type A construction, 4 stories if you've got a ground floor car park in masonry or concrete. Any insulation that's installed, non-combustible, need an automatic smoke alarm system, and we can have external timber cladding, only for low-rise buildings. So in terms of the deemed to satisfy requirements, Paul alluded to this, there's a whole suite of design guides. I had a building surveyor question me about the external use of timber cladding, and so I trawled through old publications. I couldn't find the very first one, this technical guide number 2. So I couldn't find the original one that had been put out, but in 2001 we clearly stated external walls you could use weatherboard, plywood or whatever. From an industry perspective, it's always been that way. And so all the changes, and I think where I'll use the words nervousness has come about is with the high-rise building. I was down there the morning after the fire and it wasn't a very nice site, and I can understand from a fire services perspective, you don't want to be fighting a fire on a 20-storey building, but a 3-storey building isn't too difficult from the outside. The walls are still fire, you achieve your fire resistance level. So you still have a fire-rated wall with a timber cladding on it.
Sorry,
yes.
This is probably a stupid question.
No stupid questions.
But for me, you'd be surprised.
No.
But when you say that those WoodSolutions design guides comply with DTS, how has that been determined, or who has said that it complies with DTS? Or?
When we develop up these guides, we interact with the regulators. I won't say it as much with these earlier guides for the low rise. I didn't have a lot of exposure during that phase, but definitely with the mid rise buildings, we gave technical drafts to the fire services, state-based regulators, the Australian Building Codes Board, and sought their input and feedback. I don't want it to sound silly, but the WoodSolutions guide are basically viewed as the accepted practice for these types of buildings. It's the go-to document. Like I say, we engaged professionals to do these under the WoodSolutions banner, so they're very robust. We don't just release them for releasing them, but they have a lot of review and peer review of the documentation. So it's an industry document to support the DTS provisions.